All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live episode of Dispatches here on Breakthrough News. I'm Rania Khalek. The Trump administration claims it bombed Venezuela and kidnapped President Nicolás Maduro and his wife to stop a so-called narco trafficker. That's a lie. What we're witnessing is the Monroe Doctrine on steroids, what Trump's own allies are now calling the Dunroe Doctrine. The real reasons are simple: oil, empire, and China. This attack on Venezuela is part of a broader U.S. imperial offensive across Latin America, one aimed at reasserting U.S. dominance, seizing control of strategic resources, and building a supply chain that cuts China out of the region. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by journalist and political economist Ben Norton, editor of the Geopolitical Economy Report. Just give me a second here because my computer is still semi-broken. I'm gonna bring Ben in. Actually, Emily, I might need you to add Ben in because I can't see. Oh wait, I can do it. I can bring him in. Here we go. Ben is incoming. No, he's not. Wow. This is like not easy. All right, adding Ben. All right, Emily, I am gonna need you to help me. StreamYard is not cooperating with me.
Hey.
There we go. Sorry, Ben.
How's it going?
I'm dealing with like a semi-broken computer screen that's getting fixed, but anybody who's tuned into any of our live streams since the year started knows that on January 1st of this year, it was a bad omen and I broke my computer screen. So here we are. Then it's good to have you on.
It was a bad omen indeed.
Seriously, but it's great to have you back on. So much has happened in just a very short amount of time. But before we start discussing everything related to why Venezuela has been attacked, how, this is a part of a broader, like I said, as you've written about, Ben, U.S. attempt to take over the region and enforce itself and its hegemony, not just on the region, but the world. There's a China element where I'm also going to ask you how Greenland fits in. I just want to remind our audience, though, that before we jump into it, if you appreciate our work here at Breakthrough News, please consider becoming a paid member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can also make a one-time donation below on YouTube. And as I always say, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And smash that like button and share this episode. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. Ben, there's a lot to cover, but I want to start with just a quick development. We were just talking before we were recording that the U.S. is apparently attempting to get onto to confiscate an empty oil tanker that is linked to Russia in the North Atlantic. That has to do with a lot of what we're talking about, but this year just keeps getting more insane. And I want to start by playing a video that I think really lays bare the logic of this administration. It's a clip featuring Trump advisor Stephen Miller. I'm sure you've already seen it, but I think it kind of, is a good place to start because it breaks down so much of what we're going to talk about it. So here it is.
The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become the supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us, to hoard weapons from our adversaries, to be able to be positioned as an asset against the United States rather than on behalf of the United States.
Sovereign countries shouldn't be able to do what they want to do.
The Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Doctrine is all about securing the national interests of America. For years, we sent our soldiers to die in deserts in the Middle East to try to build them parliaments, to try to build them democracies, to try to give them more oil, to try to give them more resources. The future of the free world, Jake, depends on America being able to assert ourselves and our interests without apology. This whole period that happened after World War II, where the West began apologizing and groveling and begging
I don't even
and
know,
engaging these
honestly,
vast
what you're talking about right
schemes,
now.
What I'm talking about, Jake, is the idea, and by the way, you do, I know you love doing that smarmy thing, Jake, and I was hoping to be better than that this time.
I asked you about if there should be an election. I asked you if there would be an election in Venezuela. That's what I asked. I said, why was the president so quick to dismiss Machado? You answered that question. And then I said,
the objective, Jake, is security and stability for the people of Venezuela.
Wow. God, he's such a whiny Nazi. But he is the top advisor to the Trump administration. He's playing a huge role in all of this. Ben, can you explain what the Monroe Doctrine is? It's a little more nefarious than we learn about it in school in the US, which makes it seem like something maybe even good. What's the Monroe Doctrine, and how does Trump's so-called Donroe Doctrine represent an even more aggressive colonial version of it?
Well, Miller really described it pretty well there. He said that the U.S. is a superpower that should control the entire region, and he denied that the countries of the region should have sovereignty. So this is a fundamental attack on Venezuela, on Latin America as a whole, and on the basic concept of sovereignty and the concept of the Westphalian system, that nation states should not have foreign interference and they should be allowed to determine their own affairs. Miller says the U.S. should control all of the resources in the region. And, you know, Trump has said this very clearly. Immediately after attacking Venezuela and kidnapping Venezuela's constitutional president and his wife, and then sending them to New York to be, you know, subjected to a show trial. By the way, the judge overseeing this show trial is 92 years old, which is a great symbol of the decadent gerontocracy in the U.S. But getting back to this question of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, you raise an interesting point, Rania, which is that sometimes there's this nefarious presentation of the Monroe Doctrine as if it were something positive or beneficial or altruistic. The Monroe Doctrine goes back to 1823. And at this time, this was right after most countries in Latin America achieved independence from Spanish colonialism. And essentially, the U.S. empire was telling the European empires that it considered Latin America to be part of its new imperial sphere of influence. Of course, in the 19th century, we saw that the Western empires in Japan were carving up the world, and they all had their imperial spheres of influence. And the U.S., in this very cynical way, the U.S. portrayed itself as an ally of Latin America, helping to defend Latin America against European colonialists. But in reality, we know that the U.S. was replacing the European colonialists. So famously, Simón Bolívar, who was the Venezuelan revolutionary general who in the 19th century led the wars against the Spanish Empire in order to liberate South America and the modern day countries of Venezuela and Colombia and Bolivia, he famously said that the U.S. was destined by Providence to doom Latin America and try to enslave it in the name of liberty. So we saw that even 200 years ago, Simón Bolívar recognized that the U.S. empire was cynically claiming to support freedom, while in reality trying to enslave these newly independent countries of the region. Now, the modern conception of the Monroe Doctrine, it really goes back to 1904. In that year, in his State of the Union address, Teddy Roosevelt, gave a speech in which he articulated the Roosevelt corollary. Now, this is not to be confused with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is much more of a progressive leader, whereas Teddy Roosevelt was an ardent imperialist, and he was known for his big stick doctrine. There were many images of him in political cartoons carrying around a big stick and threatening countries, you know, the infamous gunboat diplomacy. And in this 1904 State of the Union, Teddy Roosevelt said that the U.S. reserved the right to militarily intervene in any country in Latin America and the Caribbean at any time if it deemed it necessary. And of course, he used very antiquated colonial language, saying that if countries were not civilized and they did not abide by justice, then the U.S. would be forced, it would be obliged to intervene. And honestly, if you listen to the Trump administration's rhetoric today, it's very similar to this rhetoric from 120 years ago. And we've actually seen that not Trump himself, of course, he invoked the Monroe Doctrine in the press conference he gave a few hours after attacking Venezuela and kidnapping its president. And he also mentioned this idea of the Donroe Doctrine, which is an updated, even more explicitly colonialist form of the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine. But also, what's even crazier is an official Trump account on Twitter posted a political cartoon of Trump standing over all of the Americas from, the northern tip of Alaska down to the southern tip of Argentina. And he held a big stick. It's incredible. This is a reference to a political cartoon from 1905, which was a political cartoon in which Teddy Roosevelt held a big stick as part of his big stick doctrine, and it said Monroe Doctrine. So here we are 121 years later, and the Trump administration is bringing back this explicitly colonialist propaganda. I mean, it's not even just, it is imperialist, but it's actually worse than imperialist. It's straight up colonialist. They're saying that physically they want to control this entire territory of all of the region. You also see like these MAGA accounts on Twitter will share an image of all of the Americas with a US flag. Like they want to colonize everywhere from Canada down to Argentina. It's just straight up old school 19th century style colonialism. And this is, of course, related to the larger strategy, which we can talk about, which is aimed at China. Of course, we're in a new Cold War, and you all at Breakthrough have talked a lot about, Cold War II and how China is the main target of this. And essentially, the US made clear that it wants to turn all of the Western Hemisphere into this kind of colonial fortress America, in which the US controls all of the strategic natural resources and create a new supply chain and control all of the infrastructure to prevent Latin America from having relations with China, to prepare for future conflict with China.
Yeah, no, so I definitely want to get into the China angle of this. But first, you just mentioned why Latin America is so strategic. There's a reason, right? Like Latin America is very rich in resources. So when we talk about going after Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves in addition to many other resources, this is part of this larger plan about really imposing U.S. hegemony on Latin America to control those resources, shape those supply chains. I'm curious if you could maybe walk us through specific to Venezuela, and then maybe broaden out into the region of what it is the U.S. the real reason behind this, because we're starting to hear some really, I think, dumb takes on why the U.S. did this. Like you've probably seen this, Ben. Is there's this attempt to try to say that Trump did this because he didn't like the way Maduro kept dancing. Because I'm sure there's some element of Trump, being bothered that Maduro was dancing while he was threatening him. But I don't think that is the reason that Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, JD Vance, all of these really right-wing imperialists decided to go about this. But tell us about why Latin America, why Venezuela and beyond is so important to the ruling class in America.
Yeah, well, before we get to the issue of China, I'll just briefly mention that the U.S. empire, its global dominance has clearly been in decline for about 2 decades now. And the main reason for that is the rise of China, which is now the world's largest economy when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. It's a manufacturing superpower. China has moved up the global value chain. It's producing high-tech products that are competing with U.S. big tech monopolies in Silicon Valley. So China is by far the biggest threat to U.S. hegemony. It's not a threat to the people of the U.S., but to the global hegemony, the dominance of the U.S. empire, and big corporate monopolies that dominate U.S. politics. And given that situation, the Trump administration has recognized that China is more powerful than even they thought. They drank their own Kool-Aid. They believed their own propaganda. They launched this trade war against China that failed. It backfired. So they had to make a strategic retreat in the short term. And essentially, the strategy of the U.S. empire is to strengthen its chokehold over the entire Western Hemisphere, to control all of this region, to maximize its power, to prepare for future conflict with China, including potential war with China. So this brings us to the importance of Latin America. You mentioned, of course, the natural resources, but it's also simply the geopolitics of the region. I mean, if there's going to be this big war with China, which the U.S. is preparing for, then they don't want any countries in Latin America to have close relations with China that could potentially be partners of China in this war in the future. They want to colonize, basically, or exercise imperial control over the entire region so they can prepare to use all of the Americas as this base of operations to wage war across the Pacific. Now, in terms of natural resources, I mean, it goes without saying that especially Venezuela, but all across the region, there are very important natural resources, including oil, natural gas, water, which is becoming very important with climate catastrophe. The U.S. and advanced economies, imperialist countries, are going to need access to lots of clean water. And critical minerals are a huge part of this. So, for instance, some of the largest reserves of lithium in the world are located in the lithium triangle in South America, which include Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. which now all have right-wing pro-US governments. Furthermore, Chile is the world's #1 producer of copper by far, and Peru is the second biggest producer. They both have right-wing pro-US governments. Brazil is the world's largest producer of iron ore. And of course, Brazil is the B in BRICS. Brazil has played a major role in helping to build this kind of multipolar project. And that's why Trump is also targeting Lula. Trump has imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil, despite the fact that Brazil actually has a trade deficit with the US. That is, the US is a trade surplus with Brazil. And Trump falsely claimed that his tariffs were aimed at trying to reduce the US trade deficit with countries like China. And yet he's putting the highest tariffs of all, 50% on Brazil, a country that actually has a trade deficit with the US. So this is part of his attempt to try to destabilize Lula. He even put sanctions on Brazil. And then, of course, getting this issue of critical minerals, there are other critical minerals needed and also rare earth elements that are needed to create this new supply chain. China dominates the global supply chain for critical minerals. And it's simply because the Chinese government has prioritized the real economy as opposed to the fictitious financial economy on Wall Street, right? Mm-hmm. China has prioritized through its industrial policy. Every 5 years, the Communist Party releases a 5-year plan. 11 years ago, China released a very ambitious industrial policy known as Made in China 2025, where China targeted these very important industries and said, we are going to become a world competitor in these strategic industries. So the Chinese government, through strategic planning, became this manufacturing superpower, and especially the leader in the global processing of rare earths and other critical minerals, which it needs in order to be the manufacturing superpower. So what this means is that today, the U.S., the U.S. economy has largely deindustrialized in the neoliberal era, and this idea was promoted that you don't need to actually build anything locally. You can offshore, and U.S. corporations will make the majority of the profit through intellectual property rights, and they'll exploit low-paid labor in the global south. And the U.S. will become a service-oriented economy focused on designing products in high-end manufacturing, but not actually manufacturing those products. So designing the iPhone, designing chips through companies like NVIDIA, which is now the most valuable company in the world, but then those would actually be physically manufactured in East Asia. Obviously, the system is kind of breaking apart now, and the U.S. wants to create this new supply chain. But the problem is, first of all, a lot of these factories are physically located in China and in general in East Asia. So the U.S. wants to remove those, and it wants to what they call nearshore and friendshore, because the U.S. recognizes that these factories are not coming back to the U.S. It's just not going to happen. The profits would be significantly lower because wages would be higher. And also, the U.S. has deindustrialized that it's lost generations of skilled workers that they would have to be trained again. And the U.S. doesn't want to spend money on education and training and vocational programs. Moreover, the U.S. government doesn't want to deal with unions. So it wants to offshore, and U.S. companies certainly don't want to deal with unions. So they want to offshore that production, but instead of having it offshored in Asia, which is where it's largely been, they want to offshore it or nearshore it in Latin America and exploit low-paid workers in Latin America. So the idea is that the U.S. military is so dependent on the supply chain that China dominates that not only is this an issue of the U.S. companies making technological goods in Asia, not only is it an issue for them, but it's also a major problem for the U.S. military industrial complex. Because as the U.S. is preparing for a future war with China, quite literally, the U.S. military industrial complex depends on China's industrial base to make the weapons and military technology it needs to prepare for a war with China. So from their perspective, this is a major catastrophic issue because obviously, if they want to make all of these missiles and bombs and planes and, they are relying on China's supply chain, when there's this future conflict they're preparing for, China could cut that off. As we saw happen with the trade war, where China defended itself against Trump's unilateral tariffs and also Biden's, this is bipartisan, the U.S. government's unilateral export restrictions on China to prevent China from getting access to certain critical goods like semiconductors. So China responded in self-defense by imposing restrictions on the export of rare earths to the U.S., which is a huge wake-up call to the U.S., especially the military-industrial complex. So the idea the U.S. has now is they want to try to recreate this entire supply chain within the Western Hemisphere, using the critical minerals and rare earths from countries in Latin America. And also they want to colonize Greenland, partially because of this. Greenland has a lot of critical minerals and rare earths. This is the idea they have. Now, whether or not they'll be successful with all this, I'm still very skeptical about it. But they spelled it all out very clearly in a very important document, which is the 2025 National Security Strategy. And if you read that document, a dozen times they talk about supply chain, supply chain, supply chain, critical minerals, critical minerals, critical minerals. They also talk about critical infrastructure, strategic infrastructure, which is, of course, related to this. China has become the largest trading partner of Latin America when you exclude Mexico. You know, Mexico has a massive border with the U.S. The U.S. and Mexico have a free trade agreement. So 80% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S. It's a special case. But if you exclude Mexico, and especially if you look at South America, China is by far the largest trading partner. And over time, we see that a continuous trend, more and more trade with China and relatively less trade with the U.S. So the U.S. wants to cut off Latin America from China. And it's not only in terms of, you know, critical minerals and trade, but also in terms of infrastructure. So we've seen that Trump, for instance, in addition to threatening to colonize Greenland, he, in violation of the sovereignty of the people of Greenland, polls show the vast majority do not want to become part of the U.S. By the way, they have free universal health care and education. That's another reason.
Yeah, why would you? Yeah, like why would you want to give that up and be a part of a country where you're just going to like increase your homeless population and food insecurity? Because that's what America
exactly.
is.
And most people in Greenland are, you know, of indigenous descent. And, you know, for racists in the U.S., they're like, they don't see these dark-skinned indigenous people as equal to them. They see them as human, like subhumans. Well, getting back to this issue of infrastructure. So, of course, Greenland's been a big talking point, but also Panama. Trump constantly threatened to take over the control of the Panama Canal. In his inauguration speech, Trump said that supposedly China controls the Panama Canal, which is not true. But he said that the U.S. is going to take it back. It's going to colonize the Panama Canal. And then soon after, Trump threatened the Panamanian government, which pressured a Hong Kong company, a private Hong Kong company, not the Chinese government. A private Hong Kong company was operating ports on both sides of the Panama Canal with concessions made by the right-wing, you know, neoliberal Panamanian government. And Trump forced the Panamanian government to pressure this Hong Kong company, CK Hutchinson, to sell its holdings to BlackRock, the largest asset manager on earth. And of course, this massive Wall Street giant. Trump announced in a speech he gave in Congress that a great U.S. company bought these ports. He didn't mention it was BlackRock because, you know, his MAGA supporters claim to be against Wall Street and BlackRock. Meanwhile, their savior, Trump, is a complete puppet of these billionaire oligarchs. He is himself a billionaire oligarch, but, you know, it just shows once again this complete hypocrisy. Getting back to infrastructure. So they're trying to take control of the Panama Canal. Trump is also threatening other strategic infrastructure in the region. For instance, China recently inaugurated a massive port, the most important port in the region on the Pacific coast in Peru, which is called the Port of Chancay, which is half owned by a private Peruvian company because Peru doesn't have state-owned companies. And the other half is owned by a state-owned Chinese company. So there are these targets of the Trump administration where basically the strategy is to force all of these companies to pressure China, to blackmail China, or to demand that China sells any ownership stake it has in these infrastructure projects and to sell them off primarily to BlackRock.
I mean, it's really incredible. I really encourage people to read the piece you wrote about this after they're done watching this, because you're breaking it down so well, because you go through the national security paper that you're talking about, the national security strategy paper that was released in 2025. You go through and you pull the parts where they talk about all of these very specific things that you're discussing in terms of why they're so obsessed with taking over the Western Hemisphere and pushing out, pushing out the Chinese and taking over all these different countries and being able to do literally exactly what Stephen Miller said in that video I opened with: when and where we please, whenever we want. It's all about exactly what you're talking about. And a part of that, as you alluded to this, is also one of the goals is basically to impose these right-wing U.S. client regimes in every single Latin American country that will just serve the interests of the U.S. ruling class and of Wall Street and, companies like BlackRock, and basically just sell all their assets off to U.S. investors. And you made this really, really fantastic map that I want to show, just to show where we're at geopolitically speaking right now in Latin America. Take a look at this map. This is embedded in the article that is at your website about all of this. And it just, obviously the pink and the red. You
should move it up a little bit because the bottom is cut off.
There we go. So as you can see, the pink is center-left governments, the red is socialist anti-imperialist governments, and the yellow is centrist governments, and the blue is right-wing pro-US governments. Some of these are a bit more recent, by the way, because Trump has been influencing these elections. Most recently, we saw that take place in Honduras. So I'm curious if you can just talk a bit about the geopolitical makeup of the region, because Venezuela is a country that had this Bolivarian revolution, this socialist revolution. And part of attacking Venezuela is to attack the left in the region because they want a totally right-wing Latin America.
Absolutely. Go up a little bit more because now the top part's cut off.
Yeah, hang on. There.
Yeah. So what's interesting is after I published this article, there was a meeting that was held in CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which was created as an alternative to the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is based in Washington and controlled by Washington. And in this meeting in CELAC, the countries did not come to an agreement on condemning the U.S. invasion of Venezuela and abduction of President Maduro because all of the countries here in blue refused to endorse the statement. And it just maps exactly. All of the right-wing governments refused to condemn the U.S. invasion, and all of the left-leaning governments did condemn the invasion. So, I mean, sometimes people, they criticize me they say, it's too simplistic to say it's a right-left divide. In Latin America, it's not too simple. It's very clear. It is a clear right-left divide. The right-wing governments are all extremely pro-U.S. and do what Trump and Washington want and Wall Street want, whereas the left-wing governments tend to be more non-aligned. And obviously the anti-imperialist governments are resisting U.S. imperialism. Now, there are two very important elections coming up this year. In May, there is an election in Colombia. And Colombia, for the first time in modern history, has a left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, who has been very outspoken against U.S. imperialism and also very supportive of Palestine, which is very funny because Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary former president of Venezuela who launched the Bolivarian Revolution, Chavez famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America because Colombia historically has been the most loyal U.S. ally run by a bunch of right-wing regimes. And for the first time, they have this left-wing president, Petro, and Trump personally imposed sanctions on Gustavo Petro while he's the president, the sitting president, which is absolutely crazy because, so usually when the U.S. imposes sanctions, I mean, they almost always violate international law, the unilateral coercive measures that violate international law. But usually there's an exception made for the head of state. They'll impose sanctions on the ministers and state-owned enterprises and all of that. But they directly impose sanctions on the sitting president of Colombia, which was clearly a threat. And then in the press conference that Trump gave a few hours after bombing Venezuela and kidnapping Maduro, he threatened Petro again. And he said, I'm quoting, he said, Petro should, quote, watch his ass, end quote. Those are the, very sophisticated words of the mafia boss who's leading the U.S. empire right now. So Colombia is a major in a country being threatened by the U.S. right now. There's 100% chance that Trump will meddle in Colombia's election this year. Brazil has another very important election in October, and all of the polls show that the left-wing president, Lula da Silva, will win that election, assuming that there's not more, U.S. meddling and chicanery. Who knows what they'll try to do. So, and then, of course, Mexico right now has a very popular left-wing government. They do not have elections coming up for 4 more years. So that's, by the way, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has been very smart in the way she's been dealing with these issues. She's been very clear in condemning U.S. imperialism and defending the sovereignty of Mexico and the region. and she's been very principled despite the extreme pressure on her. She's also one of the most popular leaders on earth. The most recent poll from a month ago showed 74% approval, which is more than 2 times Trump's approval rating. So and then of course, Cuba is being targeted. In fact, in this press conference that Trump and Marco Rubio gave, they openly threatened Cuba. And we know that Marco Rubio, who's helping to oversee these policies, Rubio is a lifelong neoconservative war hawk, and he's from Miami, Florida. He's dedicated his entire career to trying to destabilize and overthrow the leftist governments in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So, of course, Trump is absolutely complicit in all of this, and he's the one who gave the green light. But Rubio is the one who's really kind of overseeing all of these wars, and they plan on expanding it to other countries in the region.
Absolutely. And, I just want to note that we really should be calling him Narco Rubio, considering his family. I don't know if you want to say anything about that or if you know the details of that, but Narco Rubio's family talk about the drug trade or drug trafficking. He knows quite a bit about that himself. And also he comes from a Cuban family, but acts like they were kicked out by the evil communists. They left before there was a revolution, I think, in Cuba. And actually his family visited a couple times after the revolution. But please, if you want to say some things about Narco Rubio, this is the time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that he's known as Narco Rubio is because he's supported drug lords across Latin America. And by the way, Trump and Rubio, they just oversaw the pardoning of one of the worst drug dealers on earth a few weeks ago, who's the right-wing former dictator of Honduras, Juan Hernandez, who was totally backed by the U.S. government. Not only Trump, by the way, but also Obama and Biden. But he was very close to Trump. And Trump was asked about this in the press conference he gave after bombing Venezuela and kidnapping Maduro. And he looked at Rubio and he said, we talked about it. And I learned that, Trump said, I learned that this guy Hernandez was mistreated. He was, his conviction was politically motivated. It was like what Biden did to me is what they did to him. And he looked at Rubio. It's obvious that Rubio told Trump this. Trump doesn't know where Honduras is on a map. But this guy, Juan Hernandez, is literally one of the worst drug traffickers on earth. He trafficked more than 400 tons of cocaine, which is just so insane. And he was personally working with the Mexican infamous drug cartel leader, El Chapo Guzman. I mean, this is the guy that Trump just pardoned from prison. And now Trump and Rubio say that they're fighting drug trafficking. It's a joke. Now, in terms of Narco Rubio's personal life, the reason he's also known because of this is because when he was younger, he lived with his brother-in-law, Orlando Cecilia, who was a drug trafficker in Miami, Florida. And again, Rubio lived in the house with him. He knew that he was a drug trafficker. His brother-in-law was imprisoned for drug trafficking cocaine, which is now what he falsely accuses Maduro of trafficking. And then, defenders of Rubio and Trump will say, well, Rubio was young. He was in his late teens when this happened. However, after his brother-in-law, Orlando Cecilia, got out of prison, when Rubio was an adult and when he was a state representative for Florida from the Republican Party, has always been a strong supporter of his cocaine trafficking brother-in-law. And he used his position as a state representative to lobby a regulator to get a real estate license for his brother-in-law, because, of course, as a convicted felon, it's very difficult to get a real estate license. So it's not just something that he did when he was young. He's been a lifelong supporter, and he uses political position, which is corruption, to benefit his drug trafficking brother-in-law. This is a huge scandal, and it's almost never talked about. But, Rubio has been deeply linked to drug trafficking. I'll just briefly mention another quick detail. The largest, in terms of countries, the largest producer of cocaine on earth is Colombia, which has historically almost always been governed by these right-wing corrupt oligarchs who are closely linked to drug cartels. Famously, the former right-wing president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, was one of the close U.S. allies and a close personal friend of Narco Rubio. And in fact, Rubio last year, sitting in his capacity as Secretary of State and acting simultaneously as National Security Advisor, Rubio publicly defended Álvaro Uribe after Uribe faced charges of corruption. And everyone in Colombia knows he's a drug lord. And declassified documents from U.S. intelligence agencies show that Alvaro Uribe was working with the infamous Medellin cartel, one of the worst cartels, and with Pablo Escobar. This is the guy who is the president of Colombia, a drug lord, a close ally of the U.S., and a personal friend of Rubio. And Narco Rubio has continued defending him till this day.
Yeah, the drug lie, it's such a lie. It's like, do we even have to sit here and debunk it? And it's the number of holes and the administration's accusations. And now they have an indictment against Maduro that's also full of holes. And they've had to also, as you've pointed out, Ben, they've had to basically like take out the whole Cartel de los Soles accusation because it's made up by them. It's all made up, and it's all been stated even in mainstream media. And at the end of the day, like if we're going to talk about the drug trade, you know who's like the most involved in the drug trade? The US and Wall Street. I mean, You can talk about Afghanistan just to show that. You could talk about Latin America to show that. The CIA running drugs and then using the money to like fund fascist death squads. There's well-documented history of this. And I think that's why these accusations aren't sticking. And also the Trump administration tends to be quite sloppy. But I think this also brings us to, this is a continuation of US imperialism, though it is on steroids. And it is very specific to this administration in terms of the way they're doing things. But the aims are still the same. And I think this speaks to something very interesting that's taken place in the last few years. And you mentioned this earlier, is how the US is an empire in decline. And a lot of that has to do with the rise of China's economy. And I guess that leads me to my question of why is the U.S. becoming so brutal right now? I mean, when I look at things in sort of a big picture way, there was a world order that was in place that kind of worked for the U.S. for several decades after World War II, but that's not going to cut it anymore. And the U.S. is sort of moving into this much more uncivilized, brutal, return to form kind of way of dealing with the world where everything is at the barrel of a gun because they have so many guns. And it is very difficult to confront U.S. military supremacy. That's what the U.S. has left. So anyways, I'm just curious your take on that. Is why is this brutality happening now? Is it just about Trump or is it bigger than that?
It's of course bigger, but there are particularities of Trump and Rubio. And Rubio, it's very important to emphasize his role because he's kind of the Kissinger to Nixon, right? There are only two people in U.S. history who have simultaneously held the position of both Secretary of State, head of the State Department, and National Security Advisor, head of the National Security Council. The first was Henry Kissinger, and now it's Marco Rubio. So after Trump, Rubio really is the second most powerful person in the government right now. And he's kind of the brains of a lot of this. But of course, Trump is fully on board with all of it and giving, the green light to all of these warmongers. You also have this, perpetually drunk psycho Pete Hegseth, who renamed the Pentagon from the falsely named Department of Defense to the much more aptly named Department of War. And, that is accurate, but it's so funny from the so-called peace president who claimed he would be a peacemaker. Trump last year bombed 7 countries. And now, it immediately started this year bombing Venezuela. It's, again, absolutely crazy and Orwellian. But getting back to your question about, what's happening when the U.S. empire. When empires are in decline, they tend to commit their worst crimes because they become desperate and they have to lash out. In the 90s and the early 2000s, this was the unipolar moment. The Soviet Union was overthrown. The U.S. was the only superpower. It imposed its hegemony around the world. And in that kind of situation, you don't need the iron fist of the empire. You can, through a kind of neo-colonial system, through the IMF and the World Bank and, global neoliberalism, you can kind of impose your will more indirectly. But obviously, U.S. hegemony has been declining. So this is the new U.S. strategy. And it is a bit different from the kind of liberal imperialist vision. So the Obama-Biden strategy was more about reinforcing these traditional U.S. ally networks or vassal networks, especially focusing on what they call the Indo-Pacific, or what everyone else on Earth calls the Asia-Pacific, and also Europe, right? So Trump, for a variety of reasons, part of it is also like this culture war stuff. The Trump administration really doesn't like most of the governments in Europe. they're obsessed with like this racist anti-immigrant hysteria and anti-Muslim hysteria. But it's also, they want rapprochement with Russia because they see China as the main threat, and not only a threat to the US empire, but a lot of like the MAGA Trumpists, they also see of like a kind of civilizational, like a clash of civilizations, to quote, the famous Samuel Huntington book, this, right-wing Harvard political scientist. They see China, one, it's a socialist country run by a communist party. Two, it's an atheist country. Three, it's Asian, non-white, non-Christian. They see China, especially the Hegseth types, as like this massive civilizational threat to like white Christian imperialist Western civilization. And Hegseth is an insane Christian fundamentalist. He wrote a book in 2020, which is called American Crusade. That's the title. And he, of course, has Crusader tattoos like Deus Vult and all this crazy stuff from literally 1,000 years ago. And he wants to bring back the Crusades. In that book, he said that the U.S. should carry out new crusades. And he said there are 3 targets of those crusades: China, communist China, as he calls it, which, by the way, still as Secretary of War, when he gives public speeches, he always says communist China, which is just like absolutely crazy and unprofessional as a government representative, but it shows this Cold War hysteria. So communist China, he says, is the biggest threat. Then the international left, and then Islam as an entire religion. He has a crazy chapter saying there are no such thing as moderate Muslims. So it's like declaring war on China, which is 1.4 billion people, and declaring war on Muslims, which are 2 billion people.
2 billion.
So, I mean, that's almost half the world population. Anyway, so, I mean, these are the kind, like, ideologically, J.D. Vance is not very far from this either. J.D. Vance is in with all of these neo-reactionary types and, Mencius Moldbug and these they're literal fascists. Peter Thiel, and they're all obsessed with the Antichrist, and they think China. One day they say it's like Greta Thunberg is the Antichrist, and they say that China is the Antichrist. Anyway, big difference there. But the point is that, so there are these differences, right? The liberal imperialists were much more focused on strengthening NATO and solidifying this transatlantic bloc between the US and Europe, whereas the Trumpists are more, they're not that concerned about Europe. Their strategy is more solidifying imperial control over all of the Western Hemisphere, and they want strategic rapprochement with Russia. In an ideal scenario, this is not going to happen, at least for decades. Maybe like 30, 40 years from now, it's possible, but certainly in the near future, this is not going to work. But Trump admitted in an interview with Tucker Carlson, and Carlson's another one of these figures, extremely anti-China, but also sympathetic to Russia. And they wanted to try to do this grand Kissingerian triangulation strategy where they would have rapprochement with Russia and try to, at the least, to make Russia neutral in the Cold War against China, or in an ideal scenario, they would want Russia to ally with the US. It's not going to happen, like I said. It's not going to happen for decades, if it ever happens. But that's what the Trumpists would like to do. And if you read the national security strategy, they basically say that. They say that they want to reset relations with Russia, and they want strategic stability, as they say, with Russia in order to focus on China. But of course, that's not going to work. But anyway, the reason that they're focusing on this whole Donner doctrine,
I want to get the rest of your answer. Yeah, it's just, this is like a live update that's taking place to speak to the Russia issue. There, like you said, it can't happen. And also another reason it can't happen is the U.S. keeps escalating with Russia. For example, U.S. forces have now officially intercepted the oil tanker. That it's a Russian-flagged oil tanker. I'm just going to read you the update. This is from the New York Times. The U.S. military intercepted a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic that had evaded an American effort to crack down on Venezuela's energy exports, sharply escalating a confrontation with Moscow after the ouster of Maduro. The U.S. military issued a statement on X saying U.S. forces seized the vessel for violating U.S. sanctions. The Coast Guard literally boarded the vessel, the tanker, after a roughly 2-week pursuit. The Russian state-owned media broadcaster RT published images of a helicopter approaching it. The tanker, which had been registered as a Russian vessel, Russia had sent at least one naval vessel to meet and escort it. That's according to the U.S., but there were no Russian vessels in the vicinity of the tanker when the Coast Guard boarded the ship, averting the possibility of a standoff between US and Russian forces. I mean, how incredibly lunatic and dangerous. But please continue, Ben, and I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that as we go on with this.
Well, this is another reason it shows how there are so many crazy contradictions within the Trump administration. They also try to, like, in the national security strategy, you read these reports and they try to, project this idea that they have this very sophisticated plan. And there are certainly these imperial strategists in the administration who have these kind of Kissingerian imperialist realpolitik views of the world. They want to play geopolitical chess. Like Eldridge Colby, for instance, is one of the top officials in the Pentagon, now the Department of War. He's one of these extreme mouth-foaming China hawks, but he's actually a pretty smart guy. And, he's written books and articles about grand strategy and China and all this. And like he clearly, he's also the underling of Pete Hegseth, who's a crazy drunk who obviously hasn't read a book in like 10 years. And his book was obviously ghost written. But like the point is that like you have some of these imperial strategist types, the Brzezinski types, but then you have the White House, which just does all this crazy stuff, which completely contradicts like the grand imperial vision, which also shows, again, why I don't think it's going to work. Like we're talking about like what their strategy is, but at the end of the day, you mentioned that there's an element of incompetence, which is certainly, and then it's not just incompetence, like there are conflicting interests even within the ruling class, even within the Trump administration, right? Like there are, so for instance, like Trump says he wants to reindustrialize the US, but then he surrounded himself with these billionaires from Wall Street, like for instance, Scott Bessent, who is a billionaire, who is a hedge fund manager. And you know how Scott Bessent started his career? He worked at a hedge fund managed by George Soros. Soros was his boss. Soros is like one of the main funders of a lot of Democratic Party groups. And he's like this big boogeyman of the Republicans. During Trump's presidential campaign, not only the last one, not only the 2016 one, but recently in 2024, his campaign published ads portraying Soros as the puppet master controlling Biden. Meanwhile, he hired Soros's former underling, Scott Bessent, to run the Treasury. I mean, it's just like, right. It's such a joke. Like within the ruling class, there's just so many contradictions. This issue with Russia, like Trump would love, like, and you can see this whenever Trump meets with Putin, like when he met with Putin in Alaska, you could see that like Trump was really trying to get Putin to like him, was really trying to have some kind of grand deal. Putin is not going to go along with this for a variety of reasons. I don't have time to get into it, but China is by far Russia's largest trading partner. They have very complementary economies. They're founding members of BRICS. Putin has been like, through his experience working with the West, he's just been completely immunized to this idea that the West will ever change its imperialist ways. And like Putin was originally the guy who came in after this another, incompetent alcoholic, Boris Yeltsin. Putin was supposed to be the more competent, sober manager of the new Russian oligarchs, the new Russian bourgeoisie, to oversee Russia's incorporation into the West. And he realized that the West and the US-led West would not tolerate Russia as an equal, only as a subservient, vassal. So, I mean, it's not going to happen. Like Trump's grand vision is not going to happen. And then the fact that he's now seizing these vessels that are Russian because he's trying to seize Venezuelan oil to suffocate Venezuela, once again shows that, again, there's so many contradictions.
Well, I think this is also a good place to ask you, Ben, if you could maybe explain to our audience why this administration is so invested in this idea of taking over Greenland, which is now making headlines, and you have a response from those who don't want to be taken over. But what's this all about? Because I think that's the curveball it's confused a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I would say that there are kind of two main reasons. Maybe you could say three. So the first is simply what we're talking about, this idea that the U.S. wants to create this new supply chain for critical minerals. So Greenland, which is a colony of Denmark, the people of Greenland are in a very difficult situation. I feel bad for them because for years, the people of Greenland, who are indigenous people, and most of them do not look like white, what people say like Aryan, which actually doesn't mean what Aryans are. Like Indo-Aryans actually are not what we would consider white, but like Western European white. So like this is a colonized nation, right? These are indigenous peoples who have been colonized by a European power, and they've been fighting for their indigenous self-determination for many years. And they've had votes for people pushing for first autonomy, and then they officially have autonomy, but later the plan was independence. But then what really complicates it is now you have the US empire saying, okay, we're going to colonize Greenland. So now the people of Greenland are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They wanted independence from Denmark, which is part of the EU, but now they're afraid that if they get independence, the US will just colonize them. And ironically, Denmark's also a member of NATO. And, NATO has Article 5, which is the self-defense, clause saying that if one member of NATO is attacked, other members of NATO have to support them. So if the US attacks Greenland, they would technically be attacking a territory of a NATO member, which means other NATO members would have to defend Denmark against the US, which is the head of NATO. So it's a crazy situation. But anyway, the point is that the US wants to colonize Greenland and get these critical minerals to create this new supply chain, and also rare earths. So a thing about rare earths that's not very well understood is rare earths are not actually that rare. There are many rare earths around the world, but they're often not in concentrated quantities. And the bigger issue is not the location, but the issue is how environmentally destructive it is to mine and to process rare earth elements, to make rare earth magnets, which are needed for advanced technologies, including a lot of military equipment in the US military industrial complex. So it's not just getting the reserves of the rare earths, but processing them is very poisonous, very environmentally destructive. So the US would like to do that in Greenland to poison the indigenous people because Trump doesn't care about them, as opposed to doing it in the US where you would, poison a lot of the domestic US population. This is also why the US wants to do it in Ukraine, by the way, which shows how dangerous it is to be a so-called ally of the US. Trump was trying to force this, unequal treaty on Ukraine to allow the US to exploit Ukraine's critical minerals and rare earths, and also to process those rare earths to poison Ukrainians as opposed to poisoning people in the US. That's one big issue. Another big issue is related to this kind of new Cold War and militarization strategy, which is that Greenland, if you look at a map, it's, in the Western Hemisphere off of North America near Canada. And the US has one military base, but they want to build many more military bases to militarize the Arctic. And this is becoming a huge issue that's going to be, in the decades that come, it's going to be very important because climate change is melting the Arctic ice, which is making it possible now, not only for commercial vessels, but for military vessels to go through the Arctic. So the US wants to militarize this region. And especially now that China and Russia, Russia's a major Arctic power and China is becoming more active in the Arctic region. And the US wants to create military bases to prevent China and also Russia from being able to travel through the Arctic, which would be another way to travel. And it would also be a way for trade transit through the Arctic. So it's about militarization of the region. And then the kind of third big reason is related to this whole colonial Monroe Doctrine strategy, or Donroe Doctrine, which is solidifying colonial, not just imperial control, which imperialism tends to be less direct. It's more like using puppets and financial control of assets to exercise control over foreign territories, whereas colonialism tends to be more direct land control, physical control of territories. It's just a straight up colonial plan of projecting US power across the entire region and colonizing this territory. And for Trump, this is also kind of part of his personal vision. And he's kind of Trump is obsessed with his legacy. He names everything after himself. He announced these new Navy ships named after himself, everything, like the Trump ballroom and all this stuff. He made it he forced a few billionaire friends of his to donate a few $1,000s to each, child or whatever. And that they call it the Trump Fund, that everything's named after him, right? So he also has promised repeatedly that he's going to physically expand the territory of the United States, of the US empire. He made this promise multiple times. And he says, look, we're going to take over Greenland and expand US territory. And I'm going to be remembered in history as the president who expanded the US.
It's really incredible. And you see a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of disagreement about this inside the US. From the US ruling class. You see the media in the US is freaking out about it. One thing they keep on saying is that if Donald Trump does pursue this, which, by the way, he's threatening military intervention and invasion of Greenland. to take it over, which is freaking out the Europeans. But what I was watching CNN a couple hours ago, because I do that to myself. And one thing that was repeated by the analysts on CNN was that this would break NATO. I think I also saw Senator Mark Warner, who was speaking out against Trump taking over Greenland, also making the same argument that this would break NATO. You have France and allies meeting to discuss a response to a possible U.S. invasion of Greenland. So is it true? Would this break NATO? I mean, could this cause some sort of rupture? I know this is asking a lot because the Europeans are just forever licking the boot of American empire, at least in recent years, especially. But could this cause a rupture? Because I think a lot of people thought it was a joke at first in the beginning of the Trump administration. We kept hearing about Greenland and everybody was laughing. But after what's happened throughout this year, especially with Venezuela, and then now these very real threats, people are taking it much more seriously.
It's a very serious threat. I think he's going to do it. He's going to try to colonize Greenland. And unfortunately, he probably will succeed because no, Europe's not going to do anything. And, you know, the U.S. empire loves to bully and pick on small countries with people who can't defend themselves. They love bombing women and children in Gaza. They love, you know, terrorizing the people of Venezuela, invading Panama back in 1989, invading Grenada in 1983, terrorizing Nicaragua in the 80s. These countries that can't defend themselves. Obviously, you know, we see in Ukraine when, you know, you have a big power like Russia that has a significant military, yet alone China, you know, that actually starts scaring the U.S. because they can defend themselves. In terms of Greenland, what will the EU response be? Nothing. I mean, they're going to condemn it, some strong words, right? But like you said, I mean, they're completely vassalized. Even a mainstream European think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations, named after the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. This is a mainstream think tank funded by European governments. They published a very interesting paper a few years ago talking about how Europe has become vassalized by the U.S. And that was under Biden. I mean, now under Trump, it's just a whole new level where Trump is just spitting in the face of Europe, saying he doesn't care about Europe. They're all destroying themselves. This national security strategy had this crazy, like, white genocide conspiracy theory that, like, Muslims and brown people are trying to replace the population, white people in Europe. It's absolutely insanity. And meanwhile, the Europeans are saying, yes, master, whatever you want, master. You know, Trump imposed this unequal treaty on Europe in which Europe accepts 15% U.S. tariffs on European exports to the U.S., which hurt the competitiveness of European exports. And yet European countries are not allowed to impose any tariffs on U.S. exports. So it just benefits U.S. companies at the expense of European companies. And then Trump said that he forced Europe to agree to, like, spend hundreds of billions of dollars buying energy from the U.S. and also buying weapons from the U.S. So, I mean, it just, you're completely vassalized for a variety of reasons. One, the political class in Europe is completely Atlanticist, and they're completely wedded to this idea that, like, their future always must lie in deepening transatlantic partnerships. And they're also obsessed with, like, even more than in the U.S., they're obsessed with, like, this idea of liberal bourgeois democracy. Like, if you have elections, therefore your democracy, even though Europe right now is run by a bunch of, you know, oligarchs and bankers, like Macron, a multimillionaire banker, Merz in Germany. He was the head of the German arm of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. I mean, a total capitalist oligarch. We see, for instance, Italy's last president, Mario Draghi, worked for Goldman Sachs. We see that the UK is no longer in the EU, but the UK's last, you know, conservative prime minister, who's indistinguishable from the neoliberal Blairite now. The last one, Rishi Sunak, also was a banker who worked for Goldman Sachs. I mean, you go, like, through every single country. It's a joke. So, and, you know, Mark Carney in Canada, by the way, also worked for Goldman Sachs. I mean, all of these puppet leaders in the West, in Europe, in Canada, they all worked for Goldman Sachs. They just serve Wall Street. Like, it's absurd. So no, they're not going to do anything. And by the way, another major reason I should mention, another major reason why Europe won't do anything. I mentioned the political reason, but another reason is economically, the European ruling class is entirely invested in the U.S. stock market. And this is actually a major factor because you think about all these elites, they often make policy on behalf of the economic interests of them, their families, and their friends and their groups, right? And like they're all, if you look at data on European investments in US assets, not only real estate and bonds, but especially the stock market, more than any other region of the world by far, including Asia. Asia has more than half of the world population, and yet Europe, with this small population, has significantly more investments in US financial assets. Like the elites of Europe are not going to tolerate a breakup with the US because they've invested all of their wealth in the US. They're more loyal to the US than they are to their own countries. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. And then the other major issue here is most European countries, excluding France, do not have significant militaries. And so what military would they use to fight the US? They're not going to do that. Yet alone, they all want to fight a war with Russia. They don't even have the militaries to fight Russia, but they're preparing for war with Russia. And then finally, technology. Like China is the only country on earth, Russia to a lesser extent, but mainly China, that actually has technological alternatives to all of these big tech monopolies in Silicon Valley. Europe doesn't have any of them. Europe's cloud computing is provided by Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, like all of these big tech monopolies. If you look at the digital infrastructure, they all cut out Huawei. Many of these countries in Europe were using Huawei telecommunications equipment. They cut it out because the US told them to, and they said, yes, master. Europe also doesn't have any social media companies. All of the, like, I'm sure you've been to Europe, you know a lot of people, everyone uses Gmail, everyone uses Google, YouTube, everything is integrated into these US big tech corporations. The US tried to cut off Russia. At least Russia has some of its own, a few, but not that many. So like Europe is completely technologically, militarily, economically, and politically subservient to the US empire. So they're not going to do anything.
Because they've chosen to be. I mean, you do have some strong words. You have Denmark saying that should the US invade or seize Greenland, it would mark the end of the Western military alliance and a post-Second World War security. But again, those are just words. And I mean, there's also the possibility that the US could just, basically force them to sell them Greenland because they're saying we'll buy it. So there are ways around, the whole idea of militarily invading. But wow, what a pathetic state of affairs for the Europeans. I mean, just chopping their own legs off, and for what? and to go down with the U.S. empire. Before we start to wrap here, go ahead.
One quick note, Rania. Yeah. And you see all these hypocritical European leaders praise the U.S. invasion of Venezuela and kidnapping of President Maduro, the internationally recognized sovereign leader of a country sitting at the United Nations. And yet you saw Macron praise it. You saw Merz in Germany praise it. They all praised it. Ursula von der Leyen. And yet at the same time, they say they support international law. You can't have both. What they're saying is that they only support international law when it's in their interest. And they're fine with kidnapping foreign leaders they don't like. And will praise the U.S. when it does it. And then literally a few days later, after doing that, Trump feels all emboldened and he says, we're going to take Greenland next. And they're like, no, you should only do that against global South countries, not our colonies. No, you can't do it to us.
Yeah, no, it really is amazing to see that level of hypocrisy. I'm like, oh, now you care? Now you 2 years of genocide in Gaza and you were like, whatever, go ahead. Do the most disgusting, brutal things you can imagine, and we won't do anything to stop it. In fact, we'll help make it happen. And the same goes for Venezuela. And then, that it is interesting to watch that juxtaposition of attitudes. And literally, it was like CNN went from a segment of justifying kidnapping a sitting president to freaking out over Greenland. But there's a couple. I know it's late for you, Ben. I really do appreciate doing this so late your time. So I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but I'm really happy to have you on because you're like such an encyclopedia and you do such an amazing job of explaining all of these things in digestible ways, because these are really big picture. It's not complicated, but there's a lot of moving parts to it. So it can be hard to digest. But I want to kind of bring it back to Venezuela, which, as you just did, because what we are seeing also take place now is, Trump kidnapped Maduro, the president, but left the rest of the government intact for now, though a recent Reuters article did say that the administration is considering politically assassinating what's left of the leadership if they choose to not do what the U.S. tells them to do. I mean, it's just completely insane mobster behavior. But Trump is also saying, he announced this just last night, U.S. time, that Venezuela has agreed to immediately give up its oil. And that's specific to the fact that he's saying that Washington and Caracas have agreed to export $2 billion worth of Venezuelan crude to the U.S., a deal that would require reallocating cargoes originally bound for China. Because as we've seen repeated statements from Marco Rubio, from Michael Waltz at the UN, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and other U.S. officials saying is that one of the things that they're very offended by when it comes to Venezuela is how dare they sell their oil to American adversaries like China and Iran. How dare they, even though the U.S. basically took itself out of the Venezuelan oil market and then sanctioned the Venezuelan oil market. But as Manolo de los Santos, who we've interviewed on Breakthrough News, explained, he tweeted that Trump's big announcement of these 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil being sold, immediately given to the U.S. is basically reinstating a Chevron license model that Trump suspended in 2025. It directs 50% of Venezuelan production revenue from a U.S. account to Chevron, to its operations, and repay Venezuela's debt to the company. So it's not really anything that wasn't already agreed to before. But all that's to say, I'm just curious your thoughts on these recent developments, and specifically the idea that Trump keeps saying that we're going to make a ton of money off of the Venezuelan oil market, when it's this weird thing where U.S. oil companies actually demonstrated they weren't really that interested in getting involved in Venezuela. And I don't know if that has to do with the fact that the U.S. has spent years sanctioning the Venezuela oil industry, and that's made it something that's going to take a while to kind of like get back, moving the way it was. But yeah, please, your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I mean, you partially answered the question. It's because of risk and uncertainty. I'll answer that question in a second. I want to mention this issue of Trump saying that supposedly they have this deal where they'll get 30 to 50 million barrels of oil. I mean, again, the details about this are not clear. Trump has a long history of lying. Manolo made those points that are important points. For context, Venezuela produces around a little over 1 million barrels per day. Before the very heavy U.S. sanctions, it produced over 2 million per day. So production has fallen a lot, although in the past few years it has been increasing. So 30 to 50 million is pretty significant. That's like 30 to 50 days of Venezuelan oil production. But it's, just for context, it's not like suddenly the U.S. controls all of Venezuela's oil output. So It's very strange. Again, we don't know exactly what's going on here. Trump loves to throw around numbers that sound big, but for context. Now, as for companies, U.S. companies, Trump keeps saying that they're going to invest and they're going to take all the oil and make all this money. Obviously, it's very complicated for a variety of reasons. First of all, the oil infrastructure in Venezuela is really in need of a lot of repair and modernizing and updating because of the sanctions. Like, this is the whole issue, is that Venezuela's oil output was very consistent and high for years under Chavez and at the beginning of the first Maduro administration. And then in 2015, the U.S. started putting sanctions on Venezuela under Obama originally, and then they expanded and became very aggressive, very heavy sanctions. And also from 2014 to 2016, the global price of oil collapsed for a variety of geopolitical reasons. It was a very strange historical episode. There was kind of was a multiplicity of factors happening. I won't get into it in detail, but just to mention a few important ones. The U.S. has become the world's largest oil producer because there was a massive increase in shale oil production, but also, which was part of the Obama administration strategy, but also this was kind of a geopolitical weapon because at this time, in 2014, it was the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine and the beginning of the sanctions against Russia, conflict over Crimea, and then there was also the coup attempt against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil with these U.S.-backed, color revolution protests that succeeded in 2016. And then the Obama administration was trying to pressure Iran to go to the negotiating table for the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. So the U.S. was kind of using oil as a weapon against these major, targets of the U.S. empire, Russia, Iran, and Brazil. And then, of course, Venezuela. And if you go back, I remember Nicolás Maduro was giving these speeches at the time in Venezuela saying the U.S. is using oil as a weapon against us and other countries, against Russia. Even like Reuters reported on this at the time. And there was this very strange meeting where John Kerry, who was the second Obama administration Secretary of State, he went to Riyadh and they signed this strange deal where the U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia to massively overproduce oil through Saudi Aramco, which is a state-owned company. So because it's state-owned, it can operate, according to geopolitical reasons and not just the profit motive. So they massively overproduced oil, which crashed the price of oil in the global market. And according to Reuters, in return, the U.S. agreed to massively increase support for the, Salafi jihadist extremists in Syria. So there was this very strange kind of geopolitical game happening in that period from 2014 to 2016, which is the beginning of this oil war against Venezuela, the sanctions in 2015. And then in 2017, Trump came in and he just massively put the pedal to the metal to try to crush Venezuela's economy with very heavy sanctions. And if you look at like a chart of Venezuelan oil production, even the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the government's EIA, they boasted about how Venezuela's oil production collapsed, and it hit a low point in 2019 and 2020 during the U.S. coup attempt, the first Trump administration's coup attempt, when, Trump recognized this puppet, Juan Guaido, as the fake president of Venezuela. And, it is funny to go back and look at that, laughing a few years ago, because at that time it seemed so goofy and crazy. But now, of course, the situation is much more dire and extreme. Yeah. And of course, Trump, there's another element of this we haven't talked about, is simply revenge. Like Trump, his first coup attempt failed, and now he really wants to get revenge on in his new term as U.S. president. So the U.S. collapsed. The point I'm getting at here is the U.S. collapsed the Venezuelan oil sector, and because for over 100 years, before Hugo Chavez was even born, Venezuela has been a petrostate, and historically, U.S. corporations benefited a lot from that oil production. In fact, a recent study by a very good economist found that 12% of the net domestic output, which is even more limited than the GDP, like it's absolutely crazy. 12% of national income in Venezuela was going to U.S. corporations in the 50s and 60s. Like it's just like economic colonialism. Yeah. And that's what the U.S. wants to go back to. And in the case of Venezuela, so what happened is like Trump, starting under Obama, but especially in Trump's first term, he just collapsed the Venezuelan oil sector. And for 100 years, that the government has relied on oil. Like it was a petrostate, like Saudi Arabia. And the point I always say is like, imagine what would happen if the U.S. put this massive economic blockade and sanctions on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was unable to import the technology and the capital goods and also the skilled engineers and workers that they need to modernize and update their oil infrastructure. And they couldn't export oil, and the government was starved of 99% of revenue. The Saudi monarchy would collapse in like a week. And in the case of Venezuela, the fact that the government has not collapsed is a testament to the fact that there still is a lot of popular support for the Bolivarian Revolution, the fact that they've been able to survive so long. And by the way, the 99% figure, I didn't make that up. The top UN expert on sanctions, the Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, Alina Duhan, she published a very important report that was published by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that showed that 99% of Venezuelan government revenue was lost because of the sanctions. Because again, it was just a petrostate. I mean, the difference is when Chavez came in, he said previously in Venezuelan history that oil money went to benefit rich elites, a small handful of oligarchs, like, for instance, Maria Corina Machado, her family. She's cousins of like these major Venezuelan oligarchs. So these oligarchs in Venezuela, they want to get back, they want all that oil to go back to them. I mean, of course, it was actually U.S. companies that were extracting the oil, but they would pay, they would have concessions and they would pay like 20% to the Venezuelan government.
You need that local, well, you need that local comprador class, right? Like in any country. And those are all the people, not the only people, because there's also a lot of propaganda about Venezuela. So it's really sad that you see people in the diaspora, places like Argentina, who are working for like $5 a day to like, be servers, celebrating Maduro out of power because they're watching like CNN Espanol and Telemundo or whatever, channel that has been telling them for the last 15 years that the reason that Venezuela's economy sucks is because Maduro is just so horrible. I even heard someone, because Lebanon there's a big population of Lebanese Venezuelans. And then many of them went back to Lebanon in the last decade or so because the economy in Venezuela was doing worse than I guess in Lebanon at some point, at least for them, for their families and their businesses. And so you'll hear things from them like, oh, Maduro was hoarding all the oil. And I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. Like the dumbest talking points you can imagine, but I recognize it's just coming from like media illiteracy and absolute ignorance. And then in other cases, it's coming from class status. Because there's like material interest to want a Maria Corina Machado in charge. But Ben, I wanted to, go ahead.
I just want to finish this thought really quickly because I didn't fully answer the question. Yeah, I know I have a tendency to bloviate and give long answers.
No, I want you go on as long as you want. I know you need to go to sleep. So I'm awake.
It's okay.
It's
we can do a bit more.
Yeah. Okay, great.
So, in terms of U.S. companies, why they're still hesitant, I'll explain this really briefly. So I talked about how the U.S. sanctions and blockade caused this economic crisis in Venezuela. And the fact that the government did not fall is a testament to the fact that there still is popular support. And the government still tried to do as much as it can to continue the social programs. One of the biggest accomplishments, by the way, of the Bolivarian Revolution is the government has built more than 5 million housing units, which is incredible. And I've seen them. I've been to some of the small houses or the apartment units created by the government for poor and working class families in Venezuela. So, I mean, they still, and even throughout, in the past few years, throughout the sanctions and blockade, they continued these programs. So in terms of what happened with so Venezuela's oil output fell very drastically, and it's recovered recently a bit. And a lot of that's actually because of technical support from Iran and also from Russia and China. But actually, Iran really punched above its weight. And Iran has deep solidarity with revolutionary movements in Latin America because, they've suffered from sanctions since 1979, since their revolution overthrew a U.S. puppet dictator. And because Iran has been under sanctions so long, and because Iran is a pretty big country, over 100 million people, and Iran has had a big oil industry for so long, Iran has been able to kind of develop its own domestic oil infrastructure and technology. It's not entirely dependent on Western companies because of the sanctions. So Venezuela's oil infrastructure, it was dependent on U.S. and European technology. And, I've been to Venezuela several times, and I remember interviewing people like government officials and people from the state-owned company PDVSA who talked about how they couldn't import like certain technology and parts like to fix the broken infrastructure. Like, if when you pump oil, stuff breaks like over time, right? Like your computer just broke. Like you have to update infrastructure over time. And only a few companies on earth make this stuff. And a lot of it's not interoperable. You can't just like put in an Iranian part. Like it's very different technology. So Venezuela has been like slowly like replacing and modernizing this infrastructure with support from Iran, China, and Russia, which all are also major oil producers. And it's been a slow process because of the sanctions, and they've slightly increased oil production. But then, so now Trump says all these U.S. companies are going to go in. Well, first of all, it's very risky. They have no idea what's going to happen in Venezuela. First of all, we don't even know what's going to happen like in a week or a month, yet alone in a few years. If you're investing in oil capital goods, like building this infrastructure, it's a years-long process. There's a lot of upfront capital investment, and then you have to wait several years to recoup just the costs, yet alone to start making money when you're pumping the oil, right? We're talking about, in the case of Venezuela, there are estimates they would take hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. That's a lot of money. And in the case of the risk, let's say the U.S. succeeds. I don't think they will, but let's say they succeed in putting in power a puppet like Maria Corina Machado. You might see a civil war or some kind of domestic conflict. Libya, for instance, still there's a state of civil war in Libya after the U.S.-led NATO forces killed Muammar Gaddafi and overthrew the Libyan government in 2011. It's been 15 years. So imagine what that would look like in Venezuela, which, by the way, look at how the destruction of Libya by NATO caused this massive immigrant and refugee crisis in Europe. Imagine what that would do to the U.S. and other parts of Latin America. So that's a big aspect. And then finally, there's another significant factor here, which is Venezuela's oil. So not all oil, crude oil around the world is the same, right? Like you have to refine and process oil in order to use it. And the Venezuelan crude from the Orinoco Belt, which is the main source, it's very rich in hydrocarbons. Venezuela has the world's largest reserves, and they're concentrated largely in the Orinoco Belt. It's very heavy crude. It's very high in sulfur. So what this means is that it needs a lot more processing, and because it's so heavy, like when they say heavy, they literally mean heavy, very dense. So it's more difficult to drill it, to get it out of the ground. So it means that you need a lot more investment. It's more expensive. It's a lot more capital investment. And what this means is that these companies, like a lot of these companies in the US, they're more invested in light crude in the US. They don't have a lot of experience investing in this very heavy crude because they haven't been operating in Venezuela for a long time. I mean, obviously Chevron does. But the other thing is Venezuela's oil is extremely heavy. And this is also a reason why the US might want it, the US government, in order to replace imports. But it's very expensive and it's a long, difficult process to get out of the ground. One other quick point. So another point that some analysts have been pointing out, like another kind of part of this Machiavellian imperialist strategy, right, is that the US is actually now the world's largest oil producer. So people are like, why does the US want Venezuela's oil? Well, the US would also like to control the global price of oil on the market, which it can use for kind of geopolitical reasons. As I talked about, a decade ago, the US did that. And they can use this to like put pressure on Russia, for instance. The US wants to force Russia to the negotiating table to end the proxy war in Ukraine. So the US wants to also try to collapse the price of oil because Russia's a major oil producer and the Russian government relies on oil exports to fund its military. So that could be part of this kind of strategy here if the US gets more and more control over oil. But another part of this is that even though the US is the world's largest oil producer and it's a net exporter, the US still imports a lot of crude, especially heavy crude. Over 60% of the crude imported by the US is heavy crude because the vast majority of what the US produces is light crude. Heavy crude is needed for certain machinery and like asphalt. It has certain industrial uses. So right now, the U.S. imports the vast majority, about 75% of its heavy crude from Canada, including the tar sands, if you remember the protests over the tar sand pipeline. So Trump also wants to have more leverage over Canada, especially this year as they're renegotiating what used to be known as NAFTA, the free trade agreement, U.S., Mexico, Canada. And Trump is also trying to basically colonize Canada. He wants all this leverage over Canada. So there's this kind of Machiavellian plan to try to reduce U.S. imports from Canada and also Mexico, and instead replace that with this heavy crude from Venezuela. So, I mean, these are things that people are kind of talking about, speculating about, like this larger imperialist grand strategy. But again, the last thing I'll say here today, I need to emphasize that, I, of course, love talking about this stuff and researching it, and I think it's very interesting. But we should also be clear that you can have all of these imperialist grand plans, but it doesn't mean that you'll be able to accomplish it. And especially with all of these contradictions faced by the US, with all of the madness and the incompetence within the Trump administration, and finally, with the resistance we see from people in Latin America. We've seen, the US and Israel have tried to colonize Palestine for almost 100 years now. Well, even back before Israel existed, they've been doing it. They've tried to take over Lebanon. They still have not succeeded. I mean, they did succeed in overthrowing the Syrian government, but Syria is still a mess. And they still don't have full control over Syria. Look at Libya. So the US is really good at destroying countries and destabilizing independent governments, but it has not been good historically at actually accomplishing these larger imperialist goals of actually controlling these territories. So unfortunately, I think the US will continue to destabilize and overthrow these governments and cause lots of chaos and suffering, and the people of these regions will suffer. But I also think we should be sober and be clear about the fact that just because the U.S. empire has these plans doesn't mean it'll actually accomplish them.
That's a really good point. And, when you were talking about Libya, I also thought to myself about Iraq, where now, yes, companies can go into Iraq and extract oil. Chinese companies, by the way, as well, which, the US wasn't too happy about. But it took a really long time to even get to that point because the country descended into horrific violence and civil war for years and years and years. Anyways, also, by the way, while you were talking, I got a message from one of my sisters saying that this is so informative. Ben's the best. So I really, really appreciate you. I'm learning a lot from this. I really, really appreciate you taking the time, Ben. And there's one last thing I want to touch on, which is maybe not as, intricately interesting, but nonetheless very important. You and I talked about this probably like 3 years ago, and it's even more relevant today. I wanted to just really quickly before you go, Ben, talk to you about MAGA and how it's not anti-war at all. And if you needed any more proof of that, people got mad at me when I said this yesterday, which, by the way, I also want to add, if you are watching this stream, please hit the like button. Hit the like button now. And there's probably 1,200 people watching. I only see 540 likes. So you guys get to liking. There we go. I want to see that number go up. Show Ben how much you appreciate him staying awake for this. For us. But no, I'm in all seriousness. This is a serious issue because you have these sort of charlatans who've been portraying themselves since the first Trump administration came to power and MAGA became a thing as, oh, MAGA is actually like America first. And it's against foreign intervention and interference in other countries. And we're against all those wars. We don't agree with Iraq and Libya and all these awful things we did in Syria. We don't want war with Iran. But you know what I've seen happen in this second Trump administration so far? And a lot of it happened in the first two. Trump has bombed Iran. That actually is insane. Trump bombed Iran in the first administration. He murdered Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. Now he joined Israel in bombing Iran. And he didn't do that because Israel made him, by the way. That's a very common talking point. Israel and America are partners in crimes. They do things together because they have the same ideology, not because one is pulling the other in a certain direction. And now the Trump administration, MAGA, has gone and kidnapped the sitting head of state of Venezuela to try to do regime change. And that is just two of the most insane wars. That he bombed Nigeria during Christmas time this year. He's been bombing lots of countries all throughout the years. I think you mentioned 9 countries. And yes, you do have certain influencers who will express opposition to it. You have Tucker Carlson, I think, first and foremost. He's the most well-known one, who in between talking about how Somali Americans are doing bad things to American culture and should actually go away because they're so terrible, will, say some good things about Gaza, which I'm happy he does. I hope he keeps saying, talking against the genocide in Gaza. And he has said, he's spoken out against regime change in Venezuela, though he's done it. He's framed it as because you don't want to go after a conservative government, which I'm very confused by. He thinks that Venezuela is so conservative, but whatever. The point is you do have these influencers like Tucker Carlson, like Candace Owens, who also recently said, by the way, that the European whites were not responsible for slavery. It was actually the Jews. Recent famous one by Candace Owens. But yes, she does speak against the genocide in Gaza. Again, I appreciate she does that. But these are two people in a sea of warmongers. And even they are not anti-imperialists. And then, you have someone like Thomas Massie, but he's not actually MAGA. And now you have Trump actually advocating for primarying him. But all that's to say, Trump is hugging, practically kissing Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, and he wants to regime change any country that does not listen to him. So until I see all those anti-war MAGA people protesting against war in the streets, I do not believe MAGA is anti-war at all. And I just want to get your take on that before we end here, Ben.
Yeah, you said it so well. I'll just add a few quick points here. So Trump, I'm not in any way absolving Obama and Biden, who are also criminals who should be tried at The Hague. Yes. But actually, Trump has bombed more countries than both Obama and Biden, which is quite a record because they both bombed a lot of countries. In fact, I saw a report that Trump in the first year of his second term last year, he already launched more airstrikes than in all 4 years of Biden's term. And Biden, of course, he carried out the genocide in Gaza. I'm not in any way excusing him. They're all war criminals, but horrible. It's just a joke, this idea that Trump is anti-war. He's already, in 1 year, he's done even more than Biden did. And Trump now, last year in 2025, he bombed 7 countries, and altogether, considering both terms, Trump has bombed 10 countries, which is more than Obama and more than Biden. And you mentioned, neocons have been foaming at the mouth for decades about bombing Iran. Trump actually did it. And by the way, he's going to do it again. I'm pretty sure he will, which is very scary to think about because they want to go for full-on regime change. They think they can accomplish it.
No, I think this year they're going to try to assassinate the entire Iranian leadership. That's what I think will likely happen. But please, go ahead.
They already did it to a big part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this idea that Trump is anti-war is so absurd. And unfortunately, the the way that they kidnapped President Maduro, they got the wrong lessons out of it. And now they think it's so easy and there are no consequences. And if you listen to Trump's rhetoric, he said no one died. Well, because, these imperialists in Washington don't consider Latinos humans. They only care about their own soldiers. Whereas we now know that at least 80 Venezuelans died, and dozens, at least 30 members of the security services and the military of Venezuela were massacred by these U.S. Special Operations Forces as they were kidnapping Maduro. There's this myth that Maduro was just kidnapped and everyone surrendered and they're all traitors and no one fought. No, the U.S. literally had to massacre dozens of people to kidnap Maduro. So unfortunately, I think they got the wrong lesson from that. And now they're going to say, oh, well, this is so easy. We should go do this in Iran, and we should do this in Brazil and Colombia and Cuba. It's very dangerous. So, this is just again, every U.S. president is a war criminal, but this honestly is just it's on steroids. And I'm not saying Biden was a lesser evil. It's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying if you look at it objectively, a lot of these people convinced themselves that Trump was the lesser evil, by the way. They were well, I'm against war and intervention, and actually Trump is less interventionist. Well, we now see that that's not true. Trump is putting this on hyperdrive. He bombed 7 countries in 1 year. He's overthrowing foreign governments. He's kidnapping foreign leaders, and he's planning on doing it more and more. And again, this idea that Trump is being forced to do it. During Trump's first term, there were all these apologists saying, well, it's all the neocons around Trump that forced him to do it, ignoring the fact that Trump he's the one who appointed those neocons, for instance, Mike Pompeo, who is the CIA director who became Secretary of State. Trump appointed him. Or John Bolton, one of the worst neocons of all, one of the founders of PNAC. He was the national security advisor. Trump surrounded himself voluntarily with those people. And in the second term, where, these Trump apologists, they say, oh, now this is dark MAGA. He's fighting against the neocons. In his first term, his hands were held behind his back. Well, what is his excuse now? Marco Rubio is the second most powerful person in the government. Rubio is the one overseeing a lot of this stuff. He's a mouth-foaming neocon. And also Stephen Miller, by the way, this Nazi, he's also a neocon. Well, listen to his rhetoric. He's might makes right. It's the law of the jungle. We're the most powerful country. We will do whatever we want. We will overthrow independent governments. It's our world. This is just they can call it whatever they want. They can say, oh, this is we're being realists. And, they say international law is fake. And we're this is how real politics works. They can say it's not neoconservatism. It's just neoconservatism 2.0. They're just calling it something different.
No, I couldn't agree more. And you've been really consistent on this and been validated, I believe, very much so on this. I just want to remind people again, smash the like button if you haven't already. Super important that you do. But most importantly, Ben Norton, I really, really, really appreciate having you on. I really hope we can have you on again very soon. I love watching your show, and that's a good segue to please tell people where they can check out your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rania. It's a real pleasure. People can check out my work at geopoliticaleconomy.com. That's the website. All the links are on there, and you can find my YouTube channel. And I'll say one other quick point here. We were talking about the fake anti-war people who all sold out to Trump and the Republicans, and they convinced themselves that you and I on the left have always criticized the Democrats who say the Democrats are a lesser evil. We've always been against that for many years. It's a principled stance. But there were these weird, kind of libertarian leaning anti-war people who convinced themselves intellectually, they tied themselves in a pretzel, convincing themselves that Trump and the Republicans were the lesser evil. And a good example of this is Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Tulsi Gabbard also, she has her shady links. She was working in the U.S. military and literally doing psyops. And now she's the head of U.S. intelligence. So, whether or not it was her entire operation from the beginning was a CIA operation, we don't know. She's now overseeing the CIA. But it's so funny seeing her, the one, and seeing every few months people bring back some of her tweets from 2019, where she's we have to speak out against the regime change in Venezuela. It's all about oil. Or we have to speak out against the war against Iran and the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And meanwhile, she hasn't said anything. And the opposite. Not only has she not said anything against it, she recently released a message supporting the attack on Venezuela. So it just shows that some of these people, they were never truly committed to opposing war, yet alone imperialism. So, I mean, there are so many bad faith actors, and we now see, like, when the rubber hits the road, we see who truly was against war and empire.
Well, Nazi Nick Fuentes, Mr. America first. Everybody, trying to frame America first as though it means like, not doing wars abroad was also very excited.
It means U.S. corporations first. That's what it means.
Yeah, it means U.S. corporations first, or like the white man first, I think, for him, even though he's like not, I guess he thinks he's whatever. I mean, identity crisis happening over there, whatever. But all that's to say, no, I mean, absolutely, complete and utter charlatans. And that's certainly something you will not get from us. I think we've been saying the same thing for years and years, and it's being proven correct right now. Just a horrible state of affairs. But I'm so happy that we are able to get together and talk about it in these forums for people to watch. So, Ben, I want to thank you again so much for joining me, especially at this late hour for you. And I can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, anytime, Rania. Keep up the great work. And thank